The bloody heart hit the wheelchair's armrest with a wet slap, spattering crimson across 10-year-old Eli Fontaine's paralyzed legs. Meryl Hutchinson stood at the community gate, her HOA badge gleaming in the morning sun, watching the boy's dark eyes widen in horror. "Let weakness rot," she muttered, wiping bird entrails from her manicured fingers onto a pristine handkerchief. The mutilated crow's carcass lay twisted in the gravel beside them, its black feathers catching the wind like scattered prayers. Eli couldn't speak, couldn't move his legs, couldn't even lift his arms to brush away the gore that now stained his favorite Superman t-shirt. His enlarged head, swollen from the hydrocephalus that had shaped his entire short life, trembled as he tried to process what had just happened. The shunt beneath his scalp caught the light, a reminder of all the surgeries, all the pain, all the reasons why other children whispered when he rolled past their pristine lawns in Willowbrook Estates. "You tell your voodoo grandmother," Meryl continued, her voice dripping with venom, "that her devil magic won't work here. This is a Christian community." She leaned closer, her breath hot against his face. "Next time I see those filthy symbols chalked on our sidewalks, there'll be consequences." The woman straightened, smoothed her pressed blazer, and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like bullets in a chamber. Eli sat there for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes before his grandmother, Mémé Celeste, came rushing from their small house at the end of Maple Street. Her weathered hands shook as she lifted the bird's heart from his wheelchair, her lips moving in rapid Haitian Creole, words that sounded like wind through cemetery trees. "Sac passea, petit moine," she whispered. But Eli couldn't answer. His voice had left him along with his strength. Celeste had seen many things in her 73 years. She'd survived the earthquake that took her husband, the poverty that drove her from Port-au-Prince to Miami, then finally to this sterile suburb where her daughter had thought they'd find peace. She'd hidden her gifts, the knowledge passed down through generations of healers, tucked away like old photographs in a trunk. But as she cradled the desecrated heart in her palms, feeling its cold weight, she knew that some battles couldn't be avoided. That evening, 2 weeks before the incident that would change everything, Eli had been outside with his chalk again. He couldn't explain why he drew the symbols, only that they felt right somehow, like breathing or blinking. The patterns flowed from his mind through his fingers onto the concrete, spirals and crosses and flowers that seemed to pulse with their own quiet energy. Other children might have drawn hopscotch squares or rainbow houses, but Eli drew protection. He drew prayers he didn't know he knew. Meryl had been watching him for weeks, her disapproval growing with each passing day. She'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago after her divorce, seeking control in a life that had spiraled beyond her grasp. The HOA position gave her purpose, authority, a chance to shape the world according to her vision of propriety. She patrolled the streets, like a general surveying her troops, noting violations with the precision of a court stenographer, grass too long, paint colors unapproved, garden gnomes in violation of subdivision covenant, clause 4.7. That boy's doing devil work. She'd complained to the HOA board during their monthly meeting at the community center. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she stood at the podium, her presentation folder thick with photographs of Eli's chalk drawings. "Look at these symbols. Crosses upside down, pentagrams, who knows what other satanic imagery." She clicked through the pictures on her laptop, each one projected onto the white wall behind her, like evidence in a criminal trial. Board President Janet Kowalski squinted at the screen, adjusting her glasses. "Meryl, they look like children's drawings to me. Flowers, maybe some birds." "Birds." Meryl's voice rose an octave. "Those aren't birds. Janet, those are bat wings, demon symbols. That family is practicing witchcraft right here in our community." and we're just going to let it happen." The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. They'd grown accustomed to Meryl's crusades against holiday decorations left up too long, or mailboxes the wrong shade of black. But this felt different. Darker somehow. Treasurer Bob Martinez cleared his throat. "The child has special needs. Meryl, maybe we should show some compassion." "Compassion." Meryl slammed her hand on the podium, making the microphone squeal with feedback. "Where's the compassion for our property values, for our children who have to walk past these curse marks every day? That grandmother of his is filling his head with island superstitions, and we're enabling it." The meeting ended with no official action taken, but Meryl's frustration only deepened. She began driving past the Fontaine house multiple times each day, documenting every perceived violation. The paint wasn't quite the approved shade of beige. The small garden in front contained plants not listed in the acceptable landscaping guide. And always, there were Eli's chalk drawings, appearing overnight like graffiti from another world. It was Maria Santos, the neighbor 2 houses down, who first mentioned the grandmother's background. They'd been chatting over coffee at the community pool when Maria casually mentioned that Celeste had been some kind of healer back in Haiti. "My housekeeper's cousin knew her in Miami," Maria said, lowering her voice. "Said she could cure headaches, broken hearts, even help people find lost things. Harmless stuff. You know, old country remedies." But Meryl heard only what she wanted to hear. Healer became witch. Old country remedies became dark magic. By the time the story had fermented in her mind for a week, Celeste Fontaine had transformed into a dangerous practitioner of voodoo, corrupting an innocent disabled child and threatening the spiritual well-being of the entire neighborhood. The morning Meryl decided to take action. She'd awakened before dawn with a clarity that felt almost divine. She'd driven to the industrial section of town, where abandoned lots stretched between rusted warehouses, and found what she was looking for in a pile of debris behind a defunct auto parts store. The crow was already dead, its neck broken, eyes clouded with the milky film of recent death. She'd researched voodoo online the night before, scrolling through websites filled with photographs of altars and animal sacrifices, her disgust growing with each click. If the Fontaines wanted to play with dark forces, she'd show them what real darkness looked like, with surgical precision. She'd cut open the crow's chest with a kitchen knife, extracted its small heart, and wrapped it in a paper towel stained with what she imagined was authentic menace. Now, standing at her living room window 12 hours later, Meryl felt a satisfaction that bordered on intoxication. She'd drawn a line in the sand, established boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Let the neighborhood see what happened to those who defied community standards. Let them understand that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the enemy's age or condition. That night, she slept better than she had in months. No dreams troubled her rest. No anxieties about property values or covenant violations. She'd acted decisively, courageously, and tomorrow would bring vindication. The Fontaines would understand their place in the natural order. The chalk symbols would disappear. Order would be restored. She awakened to the sound of dripping. At first, Meryl assumed it was rain, though no clouds had darkened the previous evening's sunset. She lay in bed listening to the steady rhythm, drop after drop hitting something solid below. When she finally rose and made her way to the kitchen, she found the first stain. A dark patch on the ceiling above her breakfast nook had spread overnight, roughly the size of a dinner plate. And from its center, black liquid fell with metronomic precision onto her imported Italian tile. The smell hit her as she approached. Not water damage or mold, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in summer heat. She grabbed a stepladder from the garage and climbed up to examine the stain more closely. The surface felt soft under her finger, almost gelatinous. And when she pressed against it, More of the black substance oozed through the paint like pus from an infected wound. "What the hell?" she muttered, wiping her hand on a dish towel. The liquid had the consistency of syrup, but left no residue on her fingers, as if it existed in a state between solid and liquid, between real and imagined. She called her insurance company, then a contractor, then a second contractor when the first one couldn't explain what he was seeing. By the end of the week, 3 more stains had appeared, one above her bedroom door, spreading down the wall like spilled ink, another in the corner of her home office, where her computer hummed beneath a ceiling that seemed to weep black tears. The third and largest had bloomed across her living room ceiling, a sprawling constellation of darkness that pulsed and shifted when she wasn't looking directly at it. The contractors were baffled. "Water damage," they said, but couldn't locate the source. Mold, perhaps. But unlike any strain they'd encountered, the black substance defied every test, every chemical treatment, every attempt at removal. One worker had scraped away the affected paint and drywall only to find the stains had spread deeper, into the wooden beams themselves, as if the house's very skeleton was diseased. Meryl attacked the problem with characteristic fury. She scrubbed and painted and sealed, working 16-hour days until her hands bled and her back screamed in protest. But the stains returned each morning, larger and darker than before, accompanied by new symptoms that defied rational explanation. The walls began to feel warm to the touch, as if fevered. Shadows fell at impossible angles, stretching toward her even when she stood beneath bright lights. And always, always, the sound of dripping, growing louder each night. Her dog, Rex, a golden retriever who'd been her constant companion since the divorce, began refusing to enter the house. He'd stand at the threshold, hackles raised, whimpering and backing away from something only he could perceive. When she tried to carry him inside, he'd struggle with such panic that she finally gave up and installed a doghouse in the backyard. Though he seemed no happier there, pacing and whining until dawn, sleep became impossible. The dripping sound evolved into something else, a rhythm that seemed almost musical, like fingers drumming against wood or rain falling in patterns too complex for nature. Sometimes she thought she heard voices in the sound, whispered words in a language that felt familiar but remained frustratingly beyond comprehension. She began taking sleeping pills, then stronger medications prescribed by a doctor who seemed more concerned with her appearance than her symptoms. "You look exhausted," Dr. Patel had said during her appointment, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the tremor in her hands. "Are you experiencing unusual stress at work? At home?" How could she explain that her house was rotting from the inside out? That darkness seeped through her walls like blood through bandages. How could she describe the feeling of being watched by something that lived in the spaces between shadow and light? Instead, she'd mumbled about work pressure and taken the prescription, knowing the pills wouldn't help, but desperate for any promise of relief. 3 weeks after the incident with Eli, Meryl encountered Maria Santos at the grocery store. Maria took one look at her and stepped backward, her cart rattling against a display of canned soup. "Meryl, my God, are you all right?" Meryl caught her reflection in the store's security mirror and barely recognized herself. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her eyes seemed to have sunk deeper into her skull. Her hands shook as she gripped her shopping cart, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out as a croak. "I'm fine. Just tired." "You don't look fine." Maria glanced around nervously, as if afraid to be overheard. "Listen, I heard about what happened with the Fontaine boy. What you did with that bird. He deserved it," Meryl snapped, louder than she'd intended. Other shoppers turned to stare, their faces mixing curiosity with concern. That family is practicing witchcraft in our neighborhood. Someone had to take a stand. Maria's expression shifted from concern to something approaching fear. Meryl, you don't understand. That grandmother of his, Celeste, she's not just any old woman. My housekeeper told me more about her. She was a respected healer in Haiti, someone people came to from all over the island. The kind of person you don't cross lightly. I'm not afraid of some old woman's superstitions, Meryl said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. The fluorescent lights above them flickered, casting momentary shadows that seemed to reach toward her with grasping fingers. She warned you, Maria continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Before you did what you did. She came to your house. I saw her from my window. She stood at your door for 20 minutes. But you wouldn't answer. My housekeeper said she was probably trying to tell you not to touch the dead who protect the living. The memory surfaced, like a bubble rising from deep water. 3 days before the incident with the crow, there had been knocking at her door. Persistent, rhythmic knocking that had continued even after she'd turned off all the lights and pretended not to be home. She'd peeked through the blinds and seen the old woman standing there, her lips moving in what looked like prayer or incantation. The sight had filled Meryl with such rage that she'd considered calling the police. But eventually, the knocking had stopped. That's ridiculous, Meryl said, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. There's no such thing as curses or protective spirits or any of that nonsense. Maria studied her for a long moment, taking in the trembling hands, the sunken eyes, the way Meryl seemed to be listening to sounds only she could hear. Maybe not, she said finally, but maybe you should apologize anyway. For the boy's sake, if nothing else. Meryl wanted to laugh, to dismiss the suggestion as absurd. But something in Maria's tone stopped her. There was knowledge there, certainty that went beyond neighborhood gossip. As she watched Maria push her cart away, disappearing around the corner toward the produce section, Meryl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. That night, the symptoms worsened. The black stains had spread across every ceiling in her house, and now they were moving down the walls like slow-motion waterfalls. The wooden floors had begun to warp and buckle, and, when she walked across them, they creaked with sounds that almost resembled words. Her reflection in mirrors looked wrong somehow. The features shifted just enough to suggest she was looking at a stranger wearing her face. She tried to leave, packing a suitcase and heading for a hotel. But her car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch, as if some vital component had simply stopped functioning. 3 different mechanics examined it over the following days, each reaching the same baffling conclusion: nothing was wrong with the vehicle. Yet it refused to run. She was trapped in her rotting house like a prisoner in a cell that grew smaller each day. The emergency HOA meeting was called for a Thursday evening in mid-October. Word had spread through the neighborhood about Meryl's condition, her house, the increasingly bizarre incidents that seemed to surround her presence. Parents were keeping their children indoors when she walked past. Dogs howled when she approached. Even the mail carrier had started leaving her packages at the end of the driveway rather than approach her front door. The community center felt different that night, charged with an electricity that made the fluorescent bulbs flicker and hum. Nearly every resident of Willowbrook Estates had come, filling folding chairs arranged in concentric circles around the central table, where the HOA board sat in uncomfortable silence. Meryl arrived 20 minutes late, her appearance so shocking that several people gasped audibly when she entered. Her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung in limp strands that seemed to move independently of any breeze. But it was her eyes that disturbed people most, the way they reflected light, but seemed to hold no light of their own. like black stones polished smooth by centuries of river water. "I call this meeting to order," Janet Kowalski began, her voice shaking slightly. "We're here tonight to address concerns about recent incidents in our community, specifically involving conflicts between residents." Meryl took her usual seat at the front of the room, but the chair groaned under her weight, as if she'd become incredibly heavy, or as if the chair itself was in pain. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and people began pulling their jackets tighter around their shoulders. "Before we begin," Janet continued, "I want to acknowledge that we're dealing with sensitive issues involving a disabled child and his family. Whatever disagreements exist, we need to handle this with compassion and respect." Respect. Meryl's voice had changed, taking on a quality that made people's teeth ache. Where was the respect when that family moved their devil worship into our Christian community? Where was the compassion for the children who have to see those satanic symbols every day? Bob Martinez leaned forward, his face creased with concern. "Meryl, I've spoken with the Fontaine family. The boy draws pictures with chalk, children's pictures. There's nothing satanic about them." "You don't see what I see," Meryl said. And as she spoke, the lights above them began to strobe, fast at first, then slower, like a heartbeat gradually failing. "You don't understand what they're doing to this neighborhood, to our property values, to our children's souls." In the back of the room, Celeste Fontaine sat with Eli beside her in his wheelchair. She'd been quiet throughout the meeting, her weathered hands folded in her lap. But now she stood with a dignity that seemed to command attention. When she spoke, her accent was thick, but her words were clear. "Mrs. Meryl, you hurt my grandson. You take something sacred and make it dirty. You want to speak of souls. Look to your own." Meryl whirled around to face her, and several people later swore they saw shadows move independently of her body, stretching across the walls like dark wings. "Don't you dare lecture me, you old witch. I know what you are. I know what you've done to my house. What you've done to me." "I do nothing to you," Celeste replied, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed to echo in the room's corners. "You do this to yourself when you touch what should not be touched. When you use the dead to hurt the living, the spirits that protect children. They do not forgive easy." The temperature in the room plummeted. People's breath began to mist, and frost appeared on the windows despite the mild October evening outside. Meryl opened her mouth to respond, but instead of words, black feathers spilled from her throat, small ones at first, like those of a baby bird, then larger ones, dark and oily and very real. The crowd erupted in screams and gasps, chairs overturning as people scrambled backward. But Meryl seemed frozen in place, her mouth opening wider than should have been anatomically possible, an endless stream of feathers pouring from her throat like some grotesque magic trick. Her eyes had gone completely white, no pupil or iris visible, just blank spaces that reflected the strobing lights above. Janet grabbed the microphone, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone stay calm. Someone call 911. But before anyone could reach for their phones, Meryl collapsed. She hit the floor with a sound like breaking branches, and the feathers scattered around her began to dissolve, turning to ash that was swept away by a wind that existed only in that room. The lights stopped flickering. The temperature returned to normal, and in the sudden silence, the only sound was Eli Fontaine's quiet crying. The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, Meryl was conscious again, though she seemed to have no memory of the previous hour. She insisted she felt fine, that everyone was overreacting, but her voice was different now, smaller somehow, like an old woman's voice trapped in a younger woman's body. They took her to the hospital anyway, where doctors ran every test they could think of and found nothing wrong beyond severe exhaustion and malnutrition. But the psychiatric evaluation was different. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd worked with trauma patients for 20 years, had never encountered anything quite like Meryl's case. The woman claimed to have no memory of recent events. But, under hypnosis, she described experiences that defied rational explanation. Walls that wept black tears, shadows that moved independently of their sources. The constant sound of dripping that no one else could hear. She's not delusional in the traditional sense, Dr. Chen explained to the commitment hearing 3 days later. Her perceptions appear to be entirely real to her, but they describe phenomena that simply cannot exist, combined with the witnessed episode at the community meeting. I believe she poses a danger to herself and potentially others. The judge agreed. Meryl was committed to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital for a minimum of 6 months. Though the doctors privately doubted she would ever be released, her house stood empty for 2 weeks while the commitment process played out. And, during that time, something remarkable happened. The black stains faded. The walls stopped weeping. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the property like a shroud began to lift. But the damage was done. The city's building inspector, summoned by concerned neighbors, condemned the property after discovering that the house's wooden frame had been compromised by what he described as an unprecedented form of biological decay. The damage went too deep for repair. He explained, the entire structure would need to be demolished and rebuilt from the foundation up. Meryl's insurance company refused to pay for the damage, claiming that the cause fell outside their coverage parameters. The bank began foreclosure proceedings within a month. By Christmas, her house was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble that was trucked away to a landfill, where city workers reported that nothing would grow on the spot where it was dumped. Despite multiple attempts to seed the area with grass, the lot on Maple Street remained empty, a patch of brown earth that real estate agents found impossible to sell. 3 different families put in offers over the following year, but each one withdrew after spending a single night in a nearby hotel, claiming they'd experienced disturbing dreams about rotting houses and black rain. Eventually, the city turned it into a small park, though children avoided playing there, sensing something their parents couldn't articulate. Eli continued drawing his chalk symbols, but now they appeared on the sidewalk in front of where Meryl's house had once stood. Simple spirals and crosses and flowers that seemed to pulse with quiet life, washing away with each rain, only to reappear the next morning. The new HOA board, led by Bob Martinez, issued no complaints. In fact, they officially designated the symbols as community art and encouraged other children to add their own drawings. Celeste Fontaine lived for 3 more years, long enough to see her grandson grow stronger, his artwork evolving from chalk symbols to painted canvases that local galleries began to display. She passed quietly in her sleep on a warm Tuesday morning in May, her last words whispered in Haitian Creole to her grandson, who nodded as if he understood every syllable. At her funeral, people from 3 states came to pay their respects. They spoke of ailments cured, problems solved, children protected by a woman who had carried the wisdom of generations in her weathered hands. The pastor, despite his initial reservations about mixing Christian and traditional beliefs, found himself moved by the stories of healing and protection that filled the small church. Meryl remained at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, though her condition gradually stabilized. She no longer spoke of weeping walls or moving shadows, but she also never regained full memory of the events that led to her commitment. Dr. Chen noted in her files that the patient seemed to exist in a state of permanent twilight, aware of her surroundings, but disconnected from the deeper currents of experience that most people took for granted. On quiet days, when the autumn wind rattled the hospital's windows, Meryl would sometimes pause in her activities and cock her head as if listening to something only she could hear. The nurses learned not to ask what she was hearing, because her answer was always the same, Dripping. Always dripping. But it's not angry anymore. Just sad. The children of Willowbrook Estates grew up knowing certain unspoken rules. They knocked on wood when someone mentioned Eli's name. Not out of superstition, but out of respect for forces they sensed but couldn't name. They avoided the empty lot after dark, though it had been transformed into a pleasant little park with benches and flower beds. And they never, ever, disturbed the chalk drawings that appeared each morning on the sidewalk, understanding instinctively that some art served purposes beyond decoration. Maria Santos, who had tried to warn Meryl, became something of a neighborhood historian, documenting the events for a local newspaper article that was never published. The editor found the story too unbelievable, too dependent on supernatural explanations that couldn't be verified. But Maria kept her notes anyway, filing them in a folder labeled Things That Matter, because she understood that some truths were too important to lose, even if they were too strange to share. Years later, when new families moved into the neighborhood, old-timers would sometimes share carefully edited versions of the story. They spoke of the importance of community tolerance, of respecting cultural differences, of the dangers of letting prejudice override compassion. But they rarely mentioned the supernatural elements, the rotting house, or the coughed-up feathers, understanding that some aspects of truth were too fragile to survive in the harsh light of skeptical analysis. Eli grew into a thoughtful teenager, his art evolving from simple chalk symbols to complex paintings that seemed to capture light in ways that defied conventional understanding. His hydrocephalus remained a constant challenge, requiring ongoing medical care. But his spirit had strengthened in ways that amazed his doctors. He spoke little about the incident with Meryl, but his paintings often featured protective symbols that seemed to shimmer with their own inner radiance. The empty lot, designated as Celeste Fontaine Memorial Park 3 years after her death, became a gathering place for the neighborhood's children. They played games there, read books beneath the shade of newly planted trees, and occasionally left small offerings of flowers or stones near the bench that bore her name. No one organized these offerings, and no one questioned them. They simply appeared, like the chalk drawings, like the morning dew, like all the small miracles that remind us that the world contains more mysteries than our understanding can contain. On warm summer evenings, when the air hung still and heavy with the promise of rain, neighbors would sometimes gather in the park to share stories or watch their children play. And, if they listened carefully, very carefully, they might hear something that sounded almost like laughter carried on the wind, as if the earth itself remembered joy and wanted to share it with those who had learned to listen with more than their ears. The story of Meryl Hutchinson became a cautionary tale whispered in the quiet spaces between official histories, a reminder that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond human understanding. Her name was rarely spoken aloud, and, when it was, people inevitably found themselves knocking on wood, crossing themselves, or touching something metal, small gestures that connected them to older wisdoms their ancestors had carried across oceans and centuries. In the end, the most remarkable thing about the entire affair was how quickly the neighborhood healed. The anger and division that had threatened to tear the community apart dissolved like morning mist, replaced by a deeper understanding of the fragility of human connections and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Children played together across cultural lines. Neighbors helped neighbors without expectation of reward. And somewhere in the space between what was seen and what was felt, the spirit of an old Haitian healer continued her work, watching over those who remembered that love is stronger than fear, that protection is more powerful than persecution, and that some things in this world deserve reverence, regardless of how strange they might appear to eyes that have forgotten how to see.